Okay, so what we want to do is we want to pick up with the material where we left off. We were talking about aggregate supply last time. I was mentioning some of the things that could cause an aggregate supply curve to shift. Let's put Q, or real GDP, on the horizontal axis. The aggregate price level, we could use the CPI or the GDP deflator on the vertical axis. If you recall, we had a short-run aggregate supply curve that was upward sloping, and the idea there is as the price level goes up, the profitability of production rises. Costs aren't going up, but price is, so profits are going up, and so firms respond by hiring more workers and other resources and expanding output. So that was our aggregate supply curve. It was a short-run aggregate supply curve because we assumed that wages are fixed during the current time period. We're just assuming that, like, if the wage rate is, let's say the wage is equal to $10 an hour, then we leave the wage rate alone at $10 an hour when we draw that aggregate supply curve. That's not true forever. Wages do go up over the longer term, but over shorter periods of time, wages do tend to be fixed. And we'll talk about this later on, but the point is that's where this short-run term comes from here. But this is our upward sloping aggregate supply curve. And if you remember what I did at the end of the hour last time is I was talking about things that could cause that short-run aggregate supply curve to shift to the right, or that could cause it to shift to the left. A rightward shift, of course, is an increase in aggregate supply. A leftward shift is a decrease in aggregate supply. What could cause that? And we talked about a change in wages would shift the curve. A change in labor productivity would shift the curve. What else did we mention? Maybe I ought to look at my notes. Changes in other factor prices. Factors or factors of production, productive resources. What else did I say? A supply shock. And I think I gave an example last time. I don't know what I gave as my example last time, but maybe bad weather. Oh, I think I did talk about bad weather last time. For example, I talked about the hurricane moving its way up the East Coast and wiping things out. How about El Nino? El Nino. I don't know what I'm talking about there, but I heard it on the news. Anyway, El Nino can cause good weather in some places and bad weather in other places, and that can cause a supply shock. Back in the 70s, which I really know very little about this case, but I've read about it briefly. What happened back in the 1970s is that El Nino, that warming of the Pacific Ocean, occurred. And what happens is that comes over against South America, the western coast of South America, and it killed the anchovies. Too much heat, the anchovies could not survive, or thrive at least, couldn't reproduce and have little baby anchovies. And so what happened was the anchovy harvest went down. But anchovies were being harvested for the feed to the cattle. And so when the anchovy harvest went down, then the price of feeding cattle went up. And so then some people call that an adverse supply shock. Bad weather is raising the price of beef, and that is some negative on the supply side of the economy. What we had, another 1970s example, was the Arab oil embargo. It wasn't really the Arabs, it was OPEC oil embargo. There are Arab countries that are members of OPEC, but there are also countries that are non-Arab countries that are members of OPEC. They put an embargo on oil, that is to say they stopped shipping oil, exporting oil, for a while in the 1970s, and so that drove up the price of oil. And then OPEC raised the price of oil several more times during the 1970s, and that was considered to be a supply shock, a negative or an adverse supply shock. A beneficial supply shock, we could have a year with wonderful weather, if you want to talk about weather, and that could shift the curve to the right, for example. Or we could find some new oil and, and plentiful supplies and so forth. So anyway, supply shocks. One thing I did want to mention, because I talked about it briefly last time, but I did a little research, and so now I've got something to report to you. But I talked about unit labor cost. last time, and it takes into account both of these things. Unit labor cost is really the compensation of employees, compensation of workers, I'll say, divided by worker productivity. Okay, and the point I was making when I brought up this subject of unit labor cost is this. Usually what happens is that if there's a change in worker productivity, it doesn't just happen in isolation. We don't just have a change in productivity to end the story. Very often, though, when there's a change in worker productivity, we will see that workers' earnings go up or down as productivity changes. And so usually what we do is, since these things are changing, like simultaneously or nearly so, sometimes what we want to do is keep them together rather than treat them separately. But if compensation of workers goes up, higher wages, and there's no change in worker productivity, then the unit labor costs rise, and that would shift this curve to the left, the short-run aggregate supply curve. If workers' compensation stays the same, but productivity goes up, now we get, for the same amount of dollars that we're paying to workers, we get more output. And so, that being the case, unit labor cost, the cost of producing 1 unit of output, it goes down due to the higher worker productivity, and the short-run aggregate supply curve would shift to the left. I told you I did a little bit of research. It's maybe not very up-to-date, but it's all I could find on short notice and without putting out some real effort. But here's, let me put 3 years, 1996, 97, and 98, and then here's compensation of employees, or I'll say of workers. Output per hour of work. That's what I'm using as worker productivity. Okay, and then we'll have unit labor costs, which is just equal to compensation of workers divided by output per hour equals unit labor cost. Okay, so I have these numbers for 3 years. These are index numbers. Index equals 100 in 1992. So 1992 is our base year, if you want to call it that, for each one of these numbers. These are index numbers that we're using. Okay, so in 1996, what do we have here? 110.7, 114.7, and 119.7. Boy, a lot of 7s in there. Output per hour in 1996, 103.7, 105.2, and 107.7. 5 out of 6 of these numbers end with the number 7. Anyway, unit labor costs, we just divide the one by the other. And let's look, before we go any further, let's kind of look and see what's happening here. This index from 96 to 97, compensation of workers, it's going up by 4 points, right, from 110 to 114.7, a little less than 4%. Here, this is going up from 103 to 105. This is going up by far less than 3%, less than 2%. And so what you would expect to see is unit labor, wages are going up faster than output, so you'd expect unit labor cost to rise. This went up by 5 units, this one went up, and again, you would expect unit labor cost to go up. So let me write these down, 106.8, 109.0, and 111.1. This is what's driving that aggregate supply curve to the right or the left. And when I see unit labor costs go up from 106 to 109 to 111, that tells me that this curve is shifting to the left about 2% a year. Other things being equal, and other things aren't equal, we don't have aggregate demand up here. We're not taking the whole story into account. But if all you knew was what was happening to compensation of workers and productivity, then unit labor costs would be shifting this curve to the left by a couple % per year. Looks to me like. Okay, rise in unit labor costs. And a lot of times the people who sort of forecast the economy, you'll hear them talking a lot about unit labor costs. As I say, employers don't mind, let's say, increasing wages 5% if productivity goes up 6%. And so that's what it all comes down to, is this negotiation between workers and their employers. And both pieces of information are taken into account. We need to take both pieces of information into account when we're talking about this curve shifting. Okay. Anyway, let's go on. So there's our aggregate supply curve. Now what we want to do, I believe, yes, now what we want to do is put both those curves together. We want to put together the aggregate supply curve and the aggregate demand curve. Well, this is not exactly rocket science to know that we're supposed to look and find the point where these two curves intersect. And so, well, we've done that right there, haven't we? The aggregate supply and the aggregate demand curve intersect. Let's talk about what happens if we start off with, let's say, a price level. This is a CPI or something like that, but a price level of P1. What happens? If the price level is P1, then companies across the United States respond by producing a large quantity of output, goods and services. And the reason they do that, well, gee, there are high prices in the United States and there's big profits from production. Let's produce a lot. So, large levels of production occur. On the other hand, when the price level is high, there's not as much spending taking place. Why not as much spending taking place? Well, we've talked about this before when we talked about why the shape of the aggregate demand curve, why does it look like that? And we talked about things like we have this aggregate spending constraint. If prices go up and you have a fixed amount of money to spend, you just can't buy as many things. And so prices go up, you have less money to spend, you can't buy as many things. And we also talked about substituting used goods for new goods. And we also talked about a real balance effect. When the price level goes up, the purchasing power of those dollars in your pocket is less. And so you feel a little poorer, and so you buy fewer of all goods, all normal goods. So anyway, we talked about why people spend less in companies at a higher price level. But the point is that if we start off at a higher price level, here's what I see. I see overproduction. I see a lot being produced and a lot less being purchased, and I see inventories being built up. And when inventories are being built up, you start seeing these numbers in the economic data. By the way, inventories are very often reported like this. You'll see number sales. This is monthly. And then inventories. And what you might see is something like this. Oh, sales are, oh gosh, I don't know, $100 billion per month. Inventories are $150 billion, not per month, but just inventories are that much. That's a stock of inventory rather than on a per month basis. It's just right now. And then what you would see is an inventory to sales ratio, and what they'll say is 45 days. Inventory to sales ratio might be 45 days, meaning, as well, the ratio itself is 1.5, but these are months that we're talking about here. What that 1.5 means is we have enough in our inventories to sell to customers for the next 45 days, month and a half, even if we produce nothing. We just have enough in inventory to satisfy customers for a month and a half. So anyway, companies try to keep a certain inventory to sales ratio. Let's say, just for the moment, they like to keep a 1.5 month inventory. And so what happens is, now they're producing more and more and more, and they're not selling it. And so all of a sudden they come back and look and they say, hey, our monthly sales $100 billion, but now our inventory is $200 billion, and we've got a 2-month or a 60-day inventory. And then they start saying, this is a bad sign. We don't want all these inventories for a couple of reasons. One is we have to borrow the money to go out and buy these inventories to leave them sitting on the shelf or in the warehouse and so forth. But we have to go out and pay interest on that extra $50 billion, we private companies. And so we don't like that. But another bad sign is this: inventories get old. Right? If you've got a car that says 1986 Oldsmobile on it, even if it's never been driven, but it's an inventory, it's a brand new car sitting out there in the lot, I'm saying that car is not worth nearly as much today as it was in 1986. And so manufacturers and retailers are reluctant to hold inventories because they don't want it to get old on them where they have to take a loss on the merchandise. So anyway, what I'm saying to you is when there's this overproduction, then there's inventories being built up, and at a certain point, then the manufacturers say something like, we got to work these inventories off. These retailers, I should say, not manufacturers. We got to work these inventories off. How do we get rid of them? And the answer is stop ordering from manufacturers. And when that occurs, the manufacturers get the story, uh-oh, we're not selling, and they start cutting production. And so what I'm saying to you is they were producing out at this point, those manufacturers, and all of a sudden sales are dropping because there's not orders coming in, and so they start cutting production. And the inventories that are out there, very often their prices will be reduced to try and move those inventories to get back to the desired level. And when the different manufacturers start offering rebates and discounts and put products on sale and so forth, then the prices start coming down. So what we're doing is we're reducing the production level from where we started off, and the prices are starting to go down, and we're moving our way gradually to that equilibrium point. And finally, once we've reached this price level, P, I'll put an E there, once we reach that price level, then there is an equilibrium. There's not an unwanted buildup in inventories. We're just staying at that desired level. We're producing what we can sell. It could, all of it could have worked in the opposite direction. We could have started off at a very low price level, P2. If we did start off at P2, then there would be very low production, But even though there would be very low production, there would be a lot of individuals and companies that would want to do a lot of buying at this low price level. Purchasing, or purchases, let's say. And so what we would have in this particular case is people and companies would go out and buy a lot of merchandise. More merchandise is actually being produced. High purchases. And so what we have here is inventory drawdown. D, I can't spell, drawdown. As opposed to a buildup. And what I'm saying is this, is that those companies are selling merchandise out of their inventories. They had $150 billion worth of inventories, and all of a sudden, inventories are down to $100 billion. And they say, hey, what's going on? And the answer is, well, gee, we must be selling like $125 billion a month now that sales are higher. Sales are higher than our production, so our inventories are being drawn down. And after 2 months of increased sales, $25 billion a month, and after 2 months, inventories are a lot less. And now we have, I don't know, 0.8 months or something like that of inventory. Not very much. Uh-oh, what are we going to do? And the answer is order more supplies. This is when maybe you order something and they say, oh, that's back ordered, we're going to have that in very soon. Well, what that means is we've sold out of our inventories, and now we're having to order from the manufacturer, and the manufacturer is kind of slow filling our orders, and the reason for that, lots of orders are coming in now. So when we hear about back orders, that's basically what's taking place is spending is stronger than production is. And if spending is stronger than production, what happens is the manufacturers start saying, we're going to raise price. We're selling everything we got already, and there's still all these orders come in, let's raise the price. And they also say, we've been producing a small quantity, but we're selling so much, and we're raising price, why don't we increase production? So if you start off at this point and you increase production and you raise price, we're moving our way right up to that equilibrium. So it makes absolutely no difference where we start off, whether there's a very high price level or a low price level. Wherever we start, we're going to move our way toward that equilibrium price level, equilibrium consumer price index. And at the same time, we're moving toward the equilibrium level of real GDP. I'll put QE. E for equilibrium. Any questions about this? Pretty straightforward stuff. I know it looks like the microeconomic models that we had of supply and demand before, and there are some similarities, but it's not the same, so you need to study this, you know, as a separate subject in its own right. Any questions about this? Okay, so here's what we're talking about, is how do we get to equilibrium? Now what we want to do is turn to a slightly different subject, but it's very similar. What we want to do is we want to shift some of these aggregate supply or aggregate demand curves and see what happens. So let's start off by drawing the basic diagram. Real GDP on the horizontal axis, or again an index sort of quantity of goods and services produced. On the vertical axis, the price level. I'll put the short run aggregate supply curve, and what we want to do for a few minutes here is always label those curve number 1 or number 2 or whatever, because we're going to be shifting the curves. Aggregate demand, AD1. And we will assume that everything that has happened that needs to, we have moved to equilibrium. PEQE. Okay, now, since what I want to do is shift these curves, let me ask you first, what could cause the aggregate demand curve to shift? You should have something in your notes that tells you about that. If you'll remember, an increase in the wealth of consumers could shift that curve. Can you remember anything else? Changes in interest rates? How would a change in interest rates shift the curve? Anybody? Anybody? What was that movie at? Ferris Bueller's Day Off. Anybody? You know, have y'all seen that movie, Ferris Bueller's Day Off? It's an old movie now. That guy who said that, the teacher, anybody, his name's Ben Stein. His father is a famous economist. His father was an economist for, I think it was Richard Nixon, and President Nixon. He was the chief economist for President Nixon, and they call that the, what? What do they call that? The Council of Economic Advisors. Left me for just a second there. I was thinking of the story when Ben Stein, this actor, he went in to audition for the movie. He wanted to get that part, and so he came in and they said, well, what can you do for us today? And you know, it's audition for the part of a teacher. And so he says, I can give one of my father's lectures, because he had seen his father giving lectures before. And so they said, oh, okay, well, just get up there and do that, you know. So he gets up in front of this fake classroom, and so he starts giving this economics lecture and going over a lot of the stuff that we will, or some of the stuff that we will talk about in this class. And anyway, so there's like a big crew, you know, of people standing around here, and they're watching how this is all going. And so he's up here and he starts talking about gross domestic product and equilibrium, GDP and things like this, you know, and the people are out there in the crowd, and at first they start to smile, and then they start to chuckle, and all of a sudden they're just laughing, ha ha ha, this is the funniest thing I ever heard. They thought it was all something to be mocked, as opposed to something that's very serious, is the way we take it, right? But anyway, they found that such a funny subject that he got the job on the spot, becoming that, whatever that teacher's name was, in Ferris Bueller's Day Off. So when I say anybody, I know what I'm talking about. How about this? If interest rates go up, then what we say is, gosh, my car payments are going up. I won't be able to, you know, if I'm thinking about buying a new car, that means higher car payments, higher payments for a house. So I'm less likely to buy that car or that house. So if interest rates rise, aggregate demand shifts to the left, less spending. And you remember about expectations. If we expect inflation's coming up, prices are starting to rise, then what we'll do is before the prices rise, it'll increase our aggregate demand. So what I'm saying to you, and you can go through that list, if there's a change in corporate income taxes, we reduce corporate taxes on corporate profits, then companies will say, oh, let's invest. And when they go out and start investing in more in capital equipment, that shifts the aggregate demand curve outward. Fiscal policy of the government. The government could decide to spend more to stimulate the economy. The curve shifts out. Or I gave the example the other day of at the end of the Cold War, the United States started spending less on national defense. The curve shifted to the left. There's a smaller government spending, less aggregate demand. And I also gave the example of foreign demand. If the dollar weakens relative to other currencies, it depreciates, then foreigners start buying more U.S. goods because the U.S. goods look cheaper to foreigners in their own currency. So there's an increase in aggregate demand. What else did I talk about? Let's say there's a recession overseas. Our trading partners have a recession. They can't afford to buy as many goods as before, so there's a reduction in aggregate demand. They can't afford to buy as many of our goods as before. How about this? The money supply goes up. What we said was money supply goes up. That will affect consumer spending and business spending. Larger money supply depresses interest rates, and lower interest rates stimulates spending. So anyway, and I won't go through this every single time, do all of them, but the point is that you have a list of variables that shift that aggregate demand curve, and suppose one of those comes along and shifts the aggregate demand curve to the right, AD2. Now, I'm going to put the letter A up here to sort of tell us where we started off, point A. Okay, and so if we start off at point A, now what I want to do is come back in and erase this first aggregate demand curve pretty much all the way, but I'm going to leave it there a little bit because I don't want us to forget where it was. But it's almost gone. Here's the deal. We don't have two aggregate demand curves. There's one, and it moved. It was at this old position, AD1, but now it's at AD2. Okay, so now that the aggregate demand curve moved, and there's nobody that rings a bell and says, oh, you know, it's not like on the Today Show where they come on and say, by the way, just wanted to let everybody know the aggregate demand curve shifted to the right. That doesn't happen. Nobody knows. So the aggregate demand curve shifted, and nobody told me, nobody told you, nobody told anybody. It just happened. And so when we wake up this morning, all of a sudden the aggregate demand curve's out there, and yet when we wake up this morning, the price level's still where it started, and the level of production still where it was before. And so now what I'm saying is that we are at a point A that is away from the new equilibrium. And this situation that we're looking at right now is just no different than the picture that we had up here a couple minutes ago when I was showing you how do we get to equilibrium. Because now we're not at equilibrium. Point A is not an equilibrium. It's the old equilibrium, but the new equilibrium is at point B. How do we get there? And the answer is, okay, the price level is lower than the new equilibrium, and our production is less. So what we would expect is a large volume of buying, aggregate demand increased after all, a large volume of buying compared to a small volume of production. And so now what we have is inventories are drawn down. We were just here a moment ago. Inventories are drawn down. We're buying more than is being produced. We can only buy more than is produced if there's something in the back room to come out and sell it from the back room. But now inventories go down, and at a certain point then, manufacturers start saying, we better increase production. And manufacturers and retailers are saying, we're selling everything we got, let's raise price. And so that picture that we had a moment ago of getting to equilibrium, that's the thought that comes, you know, the analysis that comes along. As soon as the aggregate demand curve shifts, then we need to come back and see how do we get to the new equilibrium. And the answer is inventories are drawn down, so we increase production. And prices are too low, we're not maximizing profits, so we raise them. And so through that process, we move to point B, the new equilibrium. And so we have PE2 and QE2, and by the way, that's what they call the Queen Elizabeth II shift, the QE2. But anyway, we have the new equilibrium point's been attained now. Manufacturing stepped up, and production of services, and price level rose. So, what's the effect of an increase in aggregate demand? A rising price level and an increase in level of production. We could have done this in exactly the opposite direction. I won't bother to, yeah, I'll bother to draw it. I've got nothing to do but just stand here and draw these pictures. That's pretty much what they pay me for. AD1, what we want to do in this particular case, this next case, is shift the aggregate demand curve to the left. So decrease in aggregate demand. And what could cause that? Decrease in consumer wealth, an increase in interest rates, the dollar strengthens relative to foreign currencies, the government cuts back on spending. We've talked about some of those. So if aggregate demand goes down, what happens? And let's just kind of draw that. There's a leftward shift in the aggregate demand curve. And the new equilibrium, which we get through by saying, uh-oh, at the original point of A, we are producing QE, but now we're only selling a smaller quantity. That is to say, at the price level PE1, we are only selling, now that aggregate demand's decreased, this small quantity. Production at the old price level was QE1, and so now what we have is inventories build up. Right? If inventories are being built up, companies at a certain point say, boy, we better cut our production. And so it's this process of cutting production and lowering prices. We're charging too much, we're not selling what we have, that we move to the new equilibrium. I'll put a B right there. And so at the new equilibrium, what we have is the aggregate demand and aggregate supply curves intersect at this new equilibrium point. So compared to point B compared to A shows us that when aggregate demand goes down, the price level goes down and real GDP goes down. Now, there's a lot of things that can affect aggregate demand. The thing I like to watch a lot in terms of is aggregate demand going up or down is I like to watch changes in the money supply. I told you earlier that in order to perceive a shift in the aggregate supply curve, I look at those unit labor costs. Well, I'm saying that in order to perceive a shift in aggregate demand, I pay close attention to changes in the money supply. If the money supply is growing rapidly, I think that's a good indicator aggregate demand is growing. If the money supply is shrinking or just not growing at all, I think that's a sign that aggregate demand is causing the economy to slow down as opposed to speed up. Anyway, the other possibility, we'll shift the aggregate supply curve now. We've got our original equilibrium, PE1, original real GDP, QE1. Part of the reason for me drawing, so many of these graphs is for you to become familiar, comfortable with the terminology and sort of the picture. Suppose I cover this up, would you be able to just sort of sketch out the diagram and label all the curves and know which curve is which one slopes upward and which one slopes downward and so forth? That's the kind of stuff that you need to be comfortable with. Anyway, suppose that something happens to increase aggregate supply. Increase aggregate supply. Oh, SRAS. And an increase is a rightward shift. You remember that. And what would cause aggregate supply to increase? How about worker productivity goes up? Right? We talked about unit labor costs earlier. So if worker productivity, if output per hour would go up and wages didn't go up, that short-run aggregate supply curve would shift to the right. How about if wages went down? Workers just said, yes, we're willing to work for a lower wage. That would shift the curve to the right. Workers usually don't like to say that, but it's possible. So anyway, that's a couple things that would shift the curve. Technological breakthroughs. All the semiconductors and so forth that have happened in recent years. We get these productivity gains that shift the curve to the right. How about a beneficial supply shock? Okay, shift the curve to the right. So anyway, let's shift the short-run aggregate supply curve SRAS2 to the right. There's only one short-run aggregate supply curve. And so this old one that I had drawn up there, that's been superseded, so to speak. And so if we look at that original point A, that equilibrium, what we say is, gosh, that point A, that original equilibrium, that doesn't seem to be an equilibrium anymore. It seems to be that compared to the new equilibrium, the price level is kind of high. And that high price level is causing a lot of production to take place. QE, no, I shouldn't call that E, Q2, there's a large level of production taking place, and yet, since the price level is unchanged, buyers are only willing to purchase this quantity QE1. So there is a surplus of production, so inventories are being built up. Inventories build up, that's a good time to cut back on production and lower price. And if you cut back on production and lower price, then we start scooting down toward that new equilibrium at point B. And so there at point B we have PE2, QE2, and that's a new equilibrium point. I guess you know what's last, right? Oh, before I go on to what's last, here's what we did. We started off at the equilibrium at A, and we went to the new equilibrium at B, and so what has happened from A to B is we've had a reduction in the price level, and we've had an increase in real GDP. Right? All I'm doing is looking at the graph and seeing that GDP, real GDP, is greater at point B than it was at A. The last possibility is a decrease in aggregate supply. Let's label our diagram the original equilibrium. There's our point A. So if there's a decrease in aggregate supply, the curve shifts to the left. What would cause that? Adverse supply shock, rising wages, reduced worker productivity, increases in other factor costs. So the curve shifts to the left, and I won't trace through every little detail here. What we do is we move to a new equilibrium at point B, and at that new equilibrium, what do we have? Is a higher price level and a smaller level of real GDP. So a higher price level and a smaller level of real GDP. Now, what we have is all four possibilities up here on the board together. We've got all four possibilities: increase or a decrease in aggregate demand, increase or decrease in aggregate supply. And then there are also mixed possibilities. I could say there's some policy that occurred that both reduced aggregate demand and increased aggregate supply, for example. And if such a policy exists, then what we would say is, well, gosh, both of these, the policy that lowered aggregate demand and the policy that increased aggregate supply, those will both tell us that the price level needs to go down. But the one policy, the one that lowered aggregate demand, that is causing real GDP to fall. And the other policy that increased short-run aggregate supply, it caused real GDP to rise. And now we're back to this question of which one of these effects is larger. If I gave you a test question and said, oh, okay, some event occurs, it depresses aggregate demand and increases aggregate supply, what will be the impact on the consumer price index? And you should say, it would go down. And then if I say, what's the impact on real GDP? Then you should say, it could go up and it could go down. It depends on which one of these shifts is greater. If it was aggregate demand that shifted by the most, then I think real GDP would go down rather than up. But if it was aggregate supply shifted by more than aggregate demand, I believe real GDP would go up, not down. This is similar to the problem that we had, or that we thought about back discussing just the microeconomic supply and demand. And by the way, we can mix and match these however you'd like to, so, you know, it's the same deal here. If you've got two cases, if there's two shifts that are taking place, an aggregate demand and aggregate supply, if there's two shifts that take place, there's always an unknown. And let's take this last one. Here's price went up, we agree there, but it's the quantities that disagree. There's always a disagreement if there's two shifts taking place. And then, in order to come to some final judgment on what happens to the equilibrium, you need to know a little bit more. You need to know what's the relative magnitude of those shifts. Okay, let us draw this diagram again. Why don't you draw one while I'm sort of erasing here, and that'll give you a little practice. But put everything there, the curves, label everything, show the original equilibrium, and then you'll have sort of a little test of your own abilities right now. There's no time like the present to find out if you can't do these problems, or can't manipulate the curves, I should say. Here's what I want to put down this time underneath my diagram. I want to draw another axis that shows employment going from 0 and getting larger. And then I want to draw another one going from the left to the right, and I want to call this unemployment. Where will I label this? Unemployment. And let's talk about this just for a second. I know you're already familiar with this. For us to produce more goods and services, and that's what happens when we move to the right in this top diagram. We're producing more and more goods and services as we move to the right. Real GDP is going up. That simply cannot occur unless we have more workers and other resources, but we absolutely must have more workers and other resources in order to produce larger levels of GDP. So even though what we have on the horizontal axis here is real GDP, we could have drawn something else on the horizontal axis, the number of workers with jobs. Right? And as we go to the right and more workers have jobs, there are fewer and fewer unemployed workers. So here, if we're starting someplace over here as 0 and we're going back in the leftward direction, we get more unemployment as we move to the left, like 1, 2, 3, 4 from right to left. So employment's going up as we move to the right, but on the other hand, if we move to the right, unemployment's going down as we go to the right. So what I'm saying to you is, let me just kind of come back up here and shift one of these curves to illustrate. If the aggregate demand curve shifts from AD1 to AD2, the equilibrium level of real GDP goes from QE1 to QE2. But then we come down here and we say, oh look, employment went up. Maybe what we had was 130 million workers with jobs to begin with. There's this employment amount. But now there's 131 million workers with jobs. And maybe we began a moment ago, we had, and I'm just making these numbers up, so don't take any of this too literally, but maybe what we had was 8 million people unemployed. And now that there's another million jobs out there, maybe we have 7 million people unemployed now. And of course, we could have stated this as an unemployment rate. Maybe the unemployment rate was 6%, now it's 5%, or something like that. Questions about this? Okay, so what we want to recognize then is, and by the way, the reason I'm sort of talking about this is in the next chapter when we come back and or the next unit of material and talk about long-run aggregate supply, then we'll make use of this information here. What we'll do is we'll start talking about, oh, there's a growing aggregate demand, the growing real GDP, growing employment, and then we'll come back and say, well, hey, I wonder if wages will start going up. Now that there's all these extra jobs, I wonder if wages will start to rise. And of course, in the next unit of material, they will, and then we'll trace through the effects of that. But anyway, the point is that you want to keep in mind that all these things are related to each other. The real GDP and the employment and the unemployment situation are related to each other. So as we understand the forces that influence real GDP, we also understand forces that influence employment and unemployment. Okay. Finally, let's come back and talk about 3 aggregate supply curves. So far, I've only drawn an upward sloping aggregate supply curve. This short-run aggregate supply curve has a positive slope, and that's all I've drawn so far. And what we want to do is we want to draw aggregate supply curves that have a different shape or different appearance now. The first aggregate supply curve I want to draw is horizontal. If we have and by the way, this one is generally believed to be I'll put the depression case. It is generally believed that this is what the aggregate supply curve looked like in the 1930s when the United States had the Great Depression. I'm sure everybody's studied that a little bit. 1930s, Great Depression. That was the single worst economic downturn in United States history. United States economic history. That was our worst downturn in the economy. I talked earlier about a business cycle and going into a recession. A depression is like a recession, only very much deeper. The unemployment rate during this period was about 25%. And that's a lot higher than it is today. It's like 5 or 6 times as high as it is today. So anyway, that's a very high unemployment rate. During that period, the thinking is that the aggregate supply curve will be horizontal. And so what happens is something like this. Here's aggregate demand AD1. We've got a price level PE1. We've got a real GDP QE1. And then if there's an increase in aggregate demand, in this depression case, AD2. There's an increase in aggregate demand. There's no inflation. The price level is still at the same level. So no inflation came along, no increase in the price level. But real GDP goes up to QE2. There's a kinked aggregate supply curve, and it has nothing to do with this horizontal one anymore, so I'll erase that. The kinked aggregate supply curve has a right angle to it. And the right angle occurs when the economies reach full employment. And I'm introducing a term here for the first time, natural real GDP. This natural is what we've added to the term. This is the real GDP that occurs at full employment. And with this aggregate supply curve, what we see is if there's an increase in aggregate demand along the horizontal stages, horizontal stretch, then we do not get any inflation. All we have is an increase in real GDP. But if aggregate demand continues to rise far enough and we get out to this kink at natural real GDP, then what happens is any increase in aggregate demand only produces inflation, only causes prices to go up, does not increase real GDP at all. We're stuck at this full employment level of GDP. And I don't have time to finish this off today, but we have a 3-stage aggregate supply curve, and that I will show you next time at the beginning of class period, and then we'll go on and talk about long-run aggregate supply. So long.